Hi, I'm your host, Nick McLean, and this is Ambition. The words volunteering and acts of service aren't often used in the same sentence as million-dollar startup, but Sam Fankuchen is writing a new story. Sam loves volunteering and wanted to help others navigate it easily, so he started Golden, which is currently the most awarded volunteer management software. They're based in Los Angeles, California, where Sam is currently the CEO, as well as serving on the board of directors for numerous other groups. Sam is a highly sought-after leader for his overall technology aptitude. I'm impressed by his background and big heart for helping others. In this episode, we're talking about finding people to solve the problem, not just having the people and figuring out what the problem is. We're learning what it takes to motivate a widget manager and how to focus on a niche to expand your business. Sam's story begins with a feel-good idea, but the formative life event that shaped his purpose is moving and important. Hello, everyone. This is Nick McLean, host of Ambition. I'm here with Sam Fankuchen, founder and CEO of Golden. Golden is the most awarded volunteer management software. He serves on the board of directors for numerous groups and is highly sought after for his overall technology aptitude. Sam, very impressive background. I would just like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your company, and how you got Golden to where it is today.
Absolutely. That would be a pleasure. It could be long, so I'll give you very short form and defer to you to take us in any direction that you think is interesting for the audience. But I'm Sam. It's my pleasure to speak on behalf of our organization, Golden. The idea behind Golden was to help anyone of any background live in their golden moments through acts of service in all their forms, and to help organizers at any scale and in any sector have a real-time understanding of the productivity of their programs so that they can make more informed decisions toward achieving their missions. And in that capacity, we've become the most popular app in the world for volunteering, and in fact, created the category of such applications, and also the most award-winning software in the world for managing public service programs. And we're lucky enough to work with about 40,000 organizations on 6 continents, some that are very informal and just getting started, and others that are global institutions that we know and respect across, again, every business sector, and sometimes in very sensitive and regulated environments, including disaster settings. So happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much. Now, how did this company even get off the ground? What was your inspiration to start it and grow it to where it is today?
Well, I've had the pleasure of sharing the story on several different podcasts. So I'll try and give a slightly different version in case you have any enthusiasts who followed us around the internet to learn about it. But
thank you.
This is my second social enterprise in the space of making volunteering more natural and more productive. And the first one I started while I was in college. But the story goes back earlier than that. I wasn't always a volunteering and public service enthusiast. In fact, for a while, I was kind of distanced from it because I saw other people becoming involved in service and thought that their experiences didn't appear to be super fulfilling or genuinely oriented. They were just performative. And I didn't want to spend my time doing those things. And I had a whole series of life events happen. One of the most formative ones was, I believed for about 36 hours that I'd lost my entire immediate family in the 9/11 attacks. And I later learned, due to a strange set of circumstances, that they had survived.
Wow.
And it made me think in a very deep way, in a very general way, about how lucky we are to be alive and what the reason for all of us being here could be for each of us. And I became very intent on finding that for myself. And that led me to wanting to serve other people so that I could understand the world around me better and understand where my skills and interests could fit into advancing quality of life for all of us. And so I tried exploring service through all of the conventional ways at the time. So we're talking about a period of time between basically 2002 and 2006. And felt that for anyone who's truly motivated to discover and participate in these activities, it was very difficult to understand where to get started. And in fact, if you talk to most people today, they would say the same thing. 90% of people in the US, for example, want to volunteer, 24% did last year. And it's largely because they don't know how to translate an interest they have into the practice, of being there, whether it's online or in person. And so we created a way for anyone of any background to see what was truly available and to participate in it in a seamless and secure way that also encourages a lifestyle of service, not just episodic service. And that changed the way that individuals were able to break into the experience. And by enabling that kind of experience for individuals, we also earn the permission to help them understand themselves better over time and be more deliberate and more effective in their activities, whether those are toward goals that they set internally or for external reasons. And likewise, in the world of professionalized philanthropy prior to Golden, there was no way to understand how productive programs were that nonprofit or other philanthropic organizations were funding and operating. They would have a sense, they'd put a budget against it, they'd do some programs, they'd try and get some feedback, but there wasn't a lot of rigor and certainly not the kind of timely evaluation of what was happening in a way that would allow for more effective investment in the programs and achievement of their targeted outcomes. And giving the organizer, and there are two different variations in simple terms of organizers that we use to think about these relationships. One are direct organizers. They have the program, they put it on, they operate it, they evaluate it. And another type are maybe indirect organizers. Indirect organizers could sponsor events operated by somebody else, could be a foundation enabling a nonprofit. It might be a religious group, government, corporate entity. It could be a consortium of entities, could be a network of entities. And they were even more removed from the understanding of the performance of the activities, even when they're the ones enabling it. And we felt if what we want is a more collaborative experience where the information is available and the outcomes can be achieved, we need to create the right environment while being respectful of the other investments and other tools that each of these organizations may or may not have on their own. That becomes a shared environment, that becomes one that prevents leakage of sensitive information while also presenting the information all of us need to know to make better choices about achieving goals in a more effective way. And the results of that software have been very transformative for even the most complicated organizations. And happy to get into some examples of that, but at a high level, just to give folks a sense of the ways that Golden has been used in complicated settings. It's been used by the first major city government in the US to do real-time reporting on disaster relief activities in order to get reimbursement from FEMA. It was used by the second largest group of hospitals in the United States to do decentralized care of discharged patients during COVID. It's used by the largest refugee placement organization in the world to do their intake. It's been used by the largest corporate day of service in the United States to organize 400 of the Fortune 500 companies on one day to do collective events. It's been used by a presidential medal receiving organization delivering food that would have gone otherwise wasted into hungry people in need. It's been used by the largest network of food banks and food pantries to have a system scale understanding of their programs. It's been used by state governments to do first ever climate activities that are now becoming the basis for models of the national model of engaging citizens in climate related activities. It's been used by political campaigns of all different parties. It's been used in a lot of different kinds of settings. And our view is that we want to focus on providing infrastructure that anyone can use to achieve their missions. We have the great privilege of having effective organizers who are very focused on their missions, put our capabilities through their paces so that we can improve them constantly, but we're not the ones necessarily designing these programs. We're just observing where the historical pain points have been and designing out unnecessary friction from those processes so that we can truly engage in these activities. And again, the results toward the missions are hugely impressive, and we're big admirers of our clients every day. It's a true honor and privilege to come to check-in calls with them and see what they achieved, where they got stuck, and be in the trenches with them. And at the same time, there's some things that are universal. So for example, the kinds of tools that are used by the organizations that I mentioned, can be adopted in seconds or sometimes a couple of weeks if you are doing a very sequenced rollout and kind of training operation for people who've been used to using other pieces of software in the past. But within the time that it takes to implement it, which usually is extremely fast, the time savings are astounding. Most organizations will save between a day and 3 days of time per person per week in automating standardized workflows. And increasingly, those who are starting to pilot our AI are seeing transformative differences in the value they're activating from each of the people they're engaging in ways that are frankly unprecedented. So in the world prior to AI, when folks were using Golden, they would start to source a higher quality resource, meaning somebody who's more aligned to the activities, who's going to come more, maybe activate more people to join them, and potentially convert to be a donor and maybe be a very good kind of donor. With AI, we're able to help each person understand where they can fit in, how powerful they can be, keep them on a personalized journey toward having that kind of effect, look for similar people to somebody like that to involve them in a similar way, and start to have folks who are transformative enablers of the mission because they become true agents of the entity, celebrating the work they're doing, activating their personal networks in ways that are not just asking for donations, but are bringing people into the fold and then asking them in the right way at the right time for the right donation. That makes all of us feel like we're fulfilling our potential rather than just responding to a request. And that part of the sector is incredibly interesting to us. I personally have been spending a lot of time there. I sit on a few different boards related to AI ethics, but also AI productivity in the social impact space, and have been engaged with the Human-Centered AI Lab at Stanford, University College London, Microsoft, and others on AI models for cross-sector collaboration.
Truly amazing. I mean, all those organizations and all the organizations that are seeking you out. I mean, there's not surprising to hear that you've had the level of success that you have or Golden has had, I should say. But as you were starting the company, what were some of the initial challenges you faced as a leader, knowing that not only you wanted this to succeed, there was almost an additional pressure because you realized how badly it was needed by all of these organizations?
It's a bizarre question to answer because I can walk you through all of the crazy things that happened, and there are many. I mean, I keep a list. I didn't originally keep a list, but it got so overwhelming that it became helpful for me to keep a list of situations that seemed impossible to surmount that we were able to surmount. And some of them are personal, because when you're deeply involved in these entities and other people are trusting you, your team members, your clients, investors, you can't let them down either. And sometimes it's beyond the organization, like place where I was living flooded twice, COVID happened. These are things that affect us every day, and you got to deal with them. And then there are also the things that happen with the company. And it's just been a big series of these. And what most entrepreneurs I listen to will say is, you got to be really gritty and you got to be able to kind of grind to the bone and see through it. And it's certainly true. I mean, if somebody were to ask you on paper, is this going to kill you or make you stronger? And it looks like a close call, and, you just got to see through to make those choices. That's one thing. But the other thing is, at least I feel, and many of my other friends who I admire in their professional careers as entrepreneurs sometimes feel, is that I know personally, I just have a different understanding of the playing field than others who've existed in this space have. I just see it differently. Like if you go watch the Dodgers right now in the playoffs, it's 2024. We're in the middle of the NLDS, which is like, I don't know, the semifinals of the baseball playoffs or whatever. And the Dodgers have a superstar on their team named Shohei Ohtani, whose skill is unprecedented in the game of baseball, or at least it appears that way in his rookie season. And when you watch somebody in a setting like that who really understands the game in a way that others haven't been able to model or express, it reminds me or others, and I'm not saying I'm the Shohei Ohtani of social impact software. But it reminds us that there are sometimes people that really do have a slightly different point of view in a way that could be considered freakish, by conventional standards, for how complicated things can fit together and look just a lot simpler if you have the right point of view. Or like, a lot of sports references here, or somebody like Steph Curry, who on paper, maybe doesn't look like the most athletic basketball player. And then you watch him play one game and your understanding of basketball becomes quite different because of what somebody's able to do. In humanitarian relief, there are examples of people like that as well in every sector. And the reason why I personally have been so involved in Golden is because I just know that if our team weren't working on this with the values that we have, the culture that we have, the access that we have to people doing meaningful work, that the work would not be done the right way. And if the work were not done the right way going into an era of AI, we can be sure that the AI is not going to fix the problem. It's only going to compound it. And we just have a real sense of duty, I will call it, to show people how it could look in one way, not saying it's the only way, but to show people what happens when you make anyone feel like they can be a part of it, when you help them understand that their activities are part of a journey, when you help them understand that big picture goals like the UN Sustainable Development Goals could be achievable if we allocate resources properly. And what can happen when you take somebody operating an organization and don't just say, here's a tool to do your job better, but you start to strip away the work that was debilitating for them so that they can feel empowered to actually achieve their mission. And we start to show real proof that missions are being achieved. I mean, what happens if you train people that way and then you have AI find patterns like that, instead of in our world what the historical precedent would be, which is get lots of content out there, don't really supervise the content to know if it's quality or not, reinforce the patterns of people engaging in suboptimal content, or use professionalized tools to reach people who are not mature in their adoption of those tools and get them to use it wrong, whether that's somebody in practice operating a program or an individual being mined for donations that isn't ready to give it in an effective way. All you're doing is reinforcing suboptimal patterns and preventing the world from getting to a better place. And so there's, of course, economics involved in our business, like there are with any other business. And we see the promise of a more mature and valuable market. And that's why we've been able to get really leading investors on board with our mission. But I think if you were going to ask them, they would say, yeah, of course, like it makes a lot of sense on paper when you do the market sizing and you look at the kind of growth metrics and revenue retention metrics and all the other things that matter for growing software companies. They would be able to justify an investment with enthusiasm. But they don't really think about that when they interact with us, because they just feel like the energy that we have as a team and what we're able to do with a small team and a big network is powerful in ways that most companies never get to experience. And we feel like we have that kind of lightning in a bottle energy.
I want to jump ahead to another topic I was going to focus on later. Some of our listeners are going to be manufacturers of widgets, for example. And as a president or owner of a company, we all need to maybe not focus, but part of what we need to do is motivate the troops and try to have a workforce that is engaged, trying to achieve a goal. You can make the argument that as the owner of a manufacturing firm that's just out there producing widgets, they don't have the luxury that you might have in terms of motivating your workforce, because there's a common good associated with what you're trying to do. Whereas the common good of the widget manufacturer is at best obfuscated a bit. What would your response be to the business owner that says, Sam, great job motivating your troops. It doesn't correlate to mine. If you were in my shoes, how would you motivate and engage a workforce of widget manufacturers?
Well, let's pick a really extreme example. Let's say we're really just talking about, like basic assembly line manufacturing. In the 90s, Toyota's Kaizen manufacturing philosophy completely upended conventional thinking about how mass production should work. And the idea behind Kaizen philosophy in manufacturing then. And this is when Toyota came from basically domestic obscurity and completely displaced American manufacturing of automobiles in the 80s and 90s. And others like them, other offshore manufacturers or others with just more sophisticated manufacturing relationships between, like line workers and management. And the theory of Kaizen has been famously documented. This is a repeat for everyone actually in the world of the question you just asked, is what if you ask every single person touching every part of production what could be done better, and you challenge them and incentivize them to implement it because it means something for the whole team? And what happens is you start to get a really good feedback loop, and you start to find competitive advantages everywhere, and you start to outcompete people. And when you do that, there's also a culture of teamwork and celebration and a degree of selflessness, but also a degree of self-celebration when you contribute to the betterment of the team. That becomes more powerful than just the pure skill of doing the job, which is also rewarding in its own way. And that enables people to do really impossible things. So I'll give you an example. Company that's sometimes in the news, but not by name. There's a nearshore manufacturer of automobile chassis in Monterrey, Mexico, which is just over the border of, basically Texas, kind of near San Antonio. And they do a lot of the pre-manufacturing before vehicles come to the United States to be manufactured. And as you can imagine, manufacturing can sometimes be a low margin business compared to something like software as a service sales, my business, right? And so you can't always have the luxury of making choices that could impact the bottom line. And sometimes there are events that require teamwork in order to power through. And so in this case, this manufacturer of vehicle chassis, that was inspired by Kaizen in the 80s and 90s, adopted it in Mexico, was able to find a way to produce respirators during COVID alongside their production of truck chassis in order to make sure that enough of the workforce and families in their city, where they were a big employer, were able to survive the pandemic and contribute to the growth of those communities and economies. That restored the faith in people buying from them, people working for them, et cetera. And if you compare that to their counterparts in the US, right now there's a crisis of retaining hourly workers. After the pandemic, everybody's reevaluating household economics about, should I be commuting to work? Should I be working overtime? Do I believe in the company I'm working for? Do I believe in the future of this industry? Could I do more on my own as an entrepreneur? Do I think that I could get upskilled or find a management role if I stayed here? And you're seeing in many sectors greater than 50% churn of employees within 2 years in hourly roles. It's becoming increasingly hard to retain and upskill and train and incentivize those people. And if you don't have a sense of belonging to the team, then your odds amazingly diminish. But if you do have a sense of belonging and a sense of the greater picture that the company can achieve due to your support of the company, then you have the ability to retain employees, reduce the recruiting costs associated with finding and retraining new employees, and you can have a very competitive business in a globalized economy. But not if you like American dream and repatriating jobs is part of it. Having a climate where we can make manufacturing a source of strength for us is important. But it doesn't matter how many economic incentives the government throws at the big picture of that equation. If companies can't translate the objectives to the team in a way that the team feels a shared goal and like everyone's incentives are aligned, then it won't be possible to compete at the velocity of firms that have figured out a way to do that in a lower cost environment. So we just bridged a pretty wide gap of talking about ecosystems of technology online across sectors to talking about pragmatic considerations of retention of hourly employees in manufacturing roles. But there's some lessons that really are universal, and giving everybody a sense of purpose in their work and celebrating everyone for their individual contributions is an essential part of a culture of effective production, whatever that production of widgets may be.
Very, very helpful answer. I love how you bridge the gap between what you're doing and the concepts of assembly line manufacturing, hourly worker retention, and whatnot. So very, very insightful answer. Thank you. As we think about your organization, surely there were plateaus or certain points when maybe not the revenues or the new organizations signing up were plateauing, but certain elements within your organization were plateauing. Maybe that was just new features being introduced. Could you talk to me a little bit about one or two periods of time when you felt the organization did plateau and how you broke through that plateau?
Yeah, I mean, there are micro examples where the solution is just iterating until you create something innovative that becomes engaging for people. And there are macro considerations about what happens when there's an existential threat to the business and you got to pivot. And so I'll start with the existential, and then if it makes sense or you have enough patience for listening to me spin my yarn here, we can talk about micro interactions as well. But on the macro scale, to give you a sense of understanding, and without disclosing too much about our business, one of our real calling cards is we have exceptional client and revenue retention rates, so much so that they would be considered basically like absolute top percentile in any industry. And we've had to work really hard to earn it. And I don't know if we ever thought we would have that in sight, especially with the sort of ratio of employees to clients that we have. It would be a very extreme example. And so it's something we've learned how to operationalize quite well. But there was a time when we lost like 65% of our revenue, recurring revenue. And it may not surprise you to hear that that was when, like, the first 6 months of the pandemic, basically a core revenue line for us is recurring software as a service contracts for enterprise scale clients buying basically business to business software from us. And when, I remember March of basically 2020, we started hearing little stirrings that, there may be this, pandemic coming about and, what would happen. And then like 48 hours later, shelter in place requirements, nobody was going to the office anymore. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. And in the world of volunteer management, where the historical organizers were basically bringing people on site, training them and then enabling them and doing kind of like top down command and control organizing of the production of whatever was getting produced, that couldn't happen. And basically nobody knew what would happen, and everyone shut down their physical operations. The problem was that usually these kinds of entities there's a bifurcation. There were two classes of clients that we were working with. One, delivering mission critical services, like, getting people to donate blood, delivering meals to people in need, operating healthcare facilities. And then there were lifestyle organizations like bake sales and, community gardens and all kinds of the other wonderful texture that makes every place we love the place that we love. And the lifestyle ones shut down kind of indefinitely. So we lost some contracts there where there wasn't a total line of sight into when they would come back, and we hoped they would. And then there were the operators of mission critical programs who also shut down, and then very quickly started to realize that by shutting down, they were compounding the consequences of the pandemic in their communities. People were not able to get the basic services they needed more than they ever needed before. And so they were forced, against a culture of complacency, as exists in many sort of like under the radar operations. They were forced to reimagine how they would deliver their core services. So if you are a food pantry, rather than bringing people on site, how are you going to feed hungry people? Well, that's going to look like decentralized logistics. And what if you've never adopted that? How would you do it? And so we built an array of tools that allowed people to decentralize what were formerly centralized programs and to enable the kinds of interactions that were considered radical at the time. And those kinds of interactions are peer-to-peer interactions. So rather than going to a specific facility, in a trusted environment, is there somebody else who could act as an independent agent and give you the service in a safer, more convenient, more timely way? And that tradition is thousands of years old. It's often referred to as mutual aid. It's kind of a tribal philosophy where you're in a group, maybe formally or informally organized. An example, formal organization may be a place of worship where you have a congregation, or you may be in a mutual aid group. Like in Brooklyn, there's certain neighborhoods that have very active mutual aid groups. Or it may be a lot less formal. Like, hey, we're in this general area. We have general interest, like in Lander, Wyoming. We're a rural community and we got to take care of ourselves because there are no services coming here, but we care about each other. And we created a technology that allowed people to safely interact with each other in a peer-to-peer way, or for a community leader to broker relationships, like a religious leader, putting people within the congregation in touch with each other, or a hospital group putting nurses in touch with patients in certain environments. And that became imperative in correcting delivery of these essential services in local communities. And it allowed us to open up the contracts again. And then, the result of that was building a level of trust by meeting our clients where they were and solving their problems in that moment, and looking past what would have been very damaging economic metrics for our organization, and just saying, we have a sense of ownership over doing what we exist to do as an organization, and there will be an end to this. We're going to try and accelerate the end to it. And we're going to learn what it takes to innovate together with our partners and hope that they come with us. And they did.
So to summarize, your perspective was definitely not reactionary. Well, I guess it wasn't, let's weather the storm. It was, we are innovators. We're doing something different. It's part of our core DNA to continue to adapt. And this is just another, not opportunity, but another situation where we're going to be forced to let our DNA help us get through this challenge. Is that at all fair to say?
Yeah. And it required total alignment of all of our stakeholders. We just had a very natural conversation about it, which is, here's what we're facing and here's what everyone else is facing. And we have some runway, a little bit. How do we want to use it? What do we feel is the right thing to do? What would we feel most proud of if we had to look back on this? And fortunately, because the premise of our company is not just what we do, like what our services are, but it's how we recruit people, what we say are our priorities when we work together, what we feel when we work together, that dictate our own framework for processing priorities. And I'm not saying everyone should have our culture. Everyone should have their own culture. But if the culture is really clear, then you can get that extra performance out of everybody, because they understand that it's not you asking something of them. It's the situation demanding it of all of us.
Very consistent with how you answered the question to the widget manufacturer. It's building a team and building the culture so that everyone is committed to the goals of the organization.
Yeah, we have never published our culture. We speak to it often. We don't usually directly say what the tenets of the culture are. But before we named the company, before we incorporated it, before we built any products, before we hired really any full-time staff, we were completely maniacally focused on creating the culture document and making it something that we could service as we grew and evolved, but something that was authentic throughout. And we created a culture that was certainly not performative, but was instead, if we deleted everything that we ever did and the culture remained, would we rebuild a company as good or better than Golden? And because that is our absolute central and only focus, and that products and team and clients are all function of the culture, it allowed us to have some operating framework in a very uncertain set of circumstances.
Well, you were clearly light years ahead of me, because the first idea I had for our company was, we were focused on manufacturing at the time. It was something along the lines of Midwest Manufacturing Acquisitions Company. And I told a few people that, and I was met with blank stares. I think that was their way of saying, Nick, that's the worst idea for a company name I've ever heard. We, of course, didn't choose that. We chose, 4 pillars to stand for the 4 ideals that myself and my partner stand for. We're a little bit more vocal about them. That's just our style. But understand where you're coming from in having those ideals really guide what the company, who the company is, and who the company will grow to be over time, as opposed to having these 5 generic words on a piece of paper or a poster, like ethical and integrity, where I feel like if you have to put those words on a piece of paper in your building, you've completely missed the boat on that one.
100% agree. So I do want to ask you a question. But before I ask you that question, Nick, because of what you said, I'll challenge the audience to say, take your culture and look at it, whatever you have documented, your 4 posters about ethics or whatever, and say, if everything about our company were deleted and the only document I could hand to somebody coming on a blank slate environment, would they build what we have or better with these values that we have or whatever document you have? And if you don't, then you need a new document. But what I would say to you, Nick, is for the benefit of all of us, myself included, can you walk us through the 4 pillars and how you decided to have that kind of principled approach for your company?
Absolutely. So again, started off with that bad idea for what the company should be called, and realized that myself and my partner were both very principle-centered people. And we came up with a list of, let's call it 14 ideals or values that we stood for. We kicked some out, we consolidated some, and ultimately realized that 4 fairly well captured 80% of what we were trying to accomplish, if you will. The first one, and the one that I would say exhibits itself or manifests itself every day in what we do, is relationships as a cornerstone for success. Anytime we meet with folks, it's not about transactional relationships. It's really about getting to know people and appreciating that person for who they are, even if that relationship is not going to benefit us directly or indirectly even. The second pillar is servant leadership. There's a lot of different concepts around servant leadership. Really, how I think about it, though, is doing things as a leader, doing things for your team, as opposed to having your team do things for you. That's how I like to think about it. That entails removing obstacles. Also, it means giving folks the ability to complete tasks on their own without micromanaging or without trying to insert your beliefs about how something should be done. The next one is challenge the status quo. My partner and I don't like things to stay static for too long. We really are great at playing devil's advocate, asking why it's being done that way, and the sister question to why has it always been done that way, or the corollary response is, well, we tried that and it didn't work. Okay, well, what's changed now that maybe we can try it again and we'll have different results. The fourth one is persistence. I've had a lot of failure in my career. I would say probably more failure than successes. But that failure is really what has made me into the person that I am. And if I didn't have that level of persistence, then I probably would just be working a 8-to-5 job, which is fine. But that would not be, I would be miserable in that because of the entrepreneurial spirit that resides within me.
Good for you. And how has your feedback loop been with your team related to those pillars?
Definitely strongest as it relates to relationships as a cornerstone for success, because that really, again, permeates almost all of what we do in what I would consider a very relationship-based industry or function that we do here. As with anything that I do, there are certainly areas where I could improve. I would say that the second area that I would like to think that I do a decent job is with servant leadership. Certainly let the team have as much ability to affect an outcome as they want. So if I try to be there whenever they need support or assistance, but I try and stand out of their way if they're not raising their hand saying help. I think for me personally, challenge the status quo and persistence, those are 2 areas that you don't coach, you don't try to implement or try and get other people to accept those. I kind of feel like to some degree, you're either going to have that drive to be persistent, have that drive to always challenge things. And if you don't, that's great. You're not a bad person. It's just those two values don't resonate with you. And I would say that to the extent that we had somebody that wasn't at all persistent or didn't at all challenge the status quo, there might be certain roles within the organization for that person. But generally speaking, my response to that would be that we didn't do a good job during the evaluation process of determining if this individual would fit well with our culture.
Yeah, hugely helpful. Thanks for sharing.
I don't know if it was hugely helpful, but I'm happy to share regardless.
Well,
Well,
your audience can let us know when their feedback.
let's see. Let me. I'm just going to consult my notes real quick. So oftentimes we think about businesses that have achieved scale as losing their entrepreneurial spirit. As companies grow, firmly believe that you need more processes, more procedures, more structure. Now, your organization, I think, is a little bit different because you've mentioned how few people you have. However, I know that you have a desire to help more organizations and continue to get Golden out to more folks to make a bigger impact. How do you think about the challenge of keeping that entrepreneurial spirit while also recognizing that as the company grows, there will need to be more structure, more processes, more procedures?
We lean into and celebrate process and procedures where it helps all of us feel like we're doing more of what we could be able to do, and not just process and procedures for the sake of having them. So there's a healthy tension between evaluating whether or not these processes and procedures will help us. And we operate in very sensitive environments. So we have to comply with regulations and other mandates. So we have a culture where we take that stuff seriously and have rigor around it. And we're the first, to rise to the occasion when there are new standards to be met. And that's, certainly part of our culture. And we would welcome it. I think where it's truly due, and we're willing to sacrifice and reevaluate, processes that don't work. And certainly, you have to try them out and try and optimize them. And if there's something that needs to come in place or they need to be removed, you have to be willing to sacrifice them as well, not just kind of lean on them too heavily. Would also say that understanding who your external stakeholders are and celebrating their stories in conjunction with your own allows a more natural tone around what it feels like to be entrepreneurial. Because sometimes you're being entrepreneurial and sometimes you're enabling people you work with to be entrepreneurial, and it doesn't always have to be you. As a founder, there's a very well-known blog post in tech circles about going into what's called founder mode. And the idea is like there's certain behaviors that founders will do as CEOs that non-founding, management CEOs might not do, that would be seen as being unusual, for better or for worse. And we can all think of CEOs that embody that, whether it's Steve Jobs or Travis Kalanick, at Uber, really kind of stepped on a lot of toes in the early days of Uber. But Uber wouldn't be Uber without a CEO like that. Today's CEO of Uber is a very different style of management. It's more appropriate for where they are in their maturity curve. They have a lot of different process, but there's a natural part in the growth curve where you really have to be an entrepreneur because the odds are against you. And showing up to customers' sites and understanding what affects them, and going to bat for your team when their life gets in the way. All these things are displays of character, and they earn trust in ways that often aren't measured, but determine the ultimate success of the company. And we just have bitten off every set of responsibilities that we possibly could, sometimes in ways that we pay the price for. But at least we have a track record of integrity in those matters. And it has earned us a huge degree of authenticity of having our own, entrepreneurial journey. And that attracts a certain type of talent that you can't get otherwise. And sometimes that culture will far outlive the founders. And sometimes people will go to extreme measures to make sure that happens. So an example for consideration, but not recommendation, in manufacturing is maybe look at somebody like Patagonia, which did something extraordinary. They basically made their company into like a trust for the employees, which first time in a prominent way that anyone had done something like that, even though employee ownership is something that gets considered a lot, or the ability to let, in some circumstances, whether it's a benefit or not a benefit, employees to organize. There are a lot of different ways to think about what it means to be an employee and have good working conditions. And I'm not sure that applying the same structure to every environment is a solution. But the question you should ask so that you avoid, for example, in a situation where unionization would not be productive for an organization if it's suboptimal for the company and for the employees, which can sometimes happen. If you want to avoid having your workforce unionize for their sake and for yours, if you're a business owner listening to a business podcast, or if you're an employee thinking about what's right for your family, what kind of company should you work in, what are the conditions like for your family, you can avoid that if there's a sense of true ownership and investment in the team member. And what that looks like varies based on the industry, the ownership structure, the market you operate in. But you should be able to have an authentic read. And if there's integrity around company doing what the company should do in its setting, and you believe in the company's choices on your own, and you're willing to take time off of your personal balance sheet, to invest in working in the company, then that's a really good start. But the company should always be looking at what they can do, what we can do as operators or owners of companies that aren't operating companies, to think about as the company being the version of itself that stakeholders requires.
Great comments. Sometimes how I think about that is for certain organizations, the company requires a level of sacrifice, of giving, etc., that it's not willing to reciprocate. They want you to be there. They want you to give up everything for the company. However, if the company hits the slightest bit of rough patch, layoffs. No level of the stability or the reciprocity, I guess, in this. And I think from my perspective, that's might be why some of these situations, unionization is a better answer, because there isn't that willingness to be there for the employees. It's only about the company.
Yeah, I mean, all these situations vary. And let's look at something like layoffs, which is a situation everyone wants to avoid. Companies shouldn't just be, and it happens this way a lot, which I can say as being a former partner in a management consultancy, I have visibility into how companies make decisions sometimes. And in mature companies, companies will look at spreadsheets of who's on their team, where the cost is coming from, what the conditions are, and they'll make broad stroke choices about who should be at the company right now. And that those can have devastating consequences for the company and for the employee. Or they can have benefits, sometimes for each. Maybe the employees get severance and it enables them to do something they wouldn't have been able to do. Maybe the company can survive and be better in the future. I mean, there are life cycles of these things, even when the conditions are hard. And, but those decisions shouldn't be taken lightly. The company shouldn't always think of more employees on something as the solution. They should be thinking of what the solution is and how many employees are required to achieve the solution, especially in a world where AI will be able to do things. And I'm not saying about automating out manufacturing jobs, which it will do to a certain degree, but it will also enable each of us as contributors to the company's benefit or society's benefit to accomplish new things with a higher degree of success. And a question all of us should be asking too is, what could I do? If I had all these modern tools, you don't even need to know how they function, but if you can just imagine what you would want to do, if you could do anything, or if you had technologies that could help you do stuff, what would that be? Because we're at a stage in the adoption and future of the world where there will be no world without AI anymore. And understanding how to interact with artificial intelligence is the fundamental responsibility of humanity from this point forward. So in each of our own little ways, I try to think of it in my own little ways every day. What are the parts of my life where maybe this is an advantage and I can start playing with it? It doesn't even need to be at work. Just get kind of comfortable with how you would use AI. But also at the system scale, the big picture, think about those questions at the same time. And where there's overlap in your interests, just develop those interests, because right now, those are the highest paying jobs that exist, are the people that understand how to apply AI to places where AI hasn't yet come, and how that can be used to create more jobs for people who can create more value with AI. So I think it's kind of an exciting time. And, I don't want to see AI come in and do things wrong and rip out productivity and infrastructure that should not have been displaced. But I think all of us want to live in a world where there's more value for all of us, and where the human quality of life is improved. So if you can think about where those areas exist for you personally or where they exist for your company and take some small steps in experimenting, then you won't have to worry about your job because a lot of people want to hire you, and you'll have a refreshed sense of honor in the work that you're doing because you can see how it's going to improve other people's lives.
Good points. Good points. I know we're approaching the top of the hour, so I want to be sensitive to your time. Just have one more line of questioning that I'd like to ask if you feel like that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Talking with other business owners, there has often been a tension between going down a more niche path versus a more generalist path, whether that's a focusing on a certain customer, focusing on a certain capability, et cetera, et cetera. In your experience leading Golden, has there been that tension between being more of a niche provider versus more of a generalist?
Yeah, and I think every business has its own trajectory, and sometimes it makes sense to be more niche, and sometimes I guess it makes more sense to be generalist. What I've heard from others is that iterating and understanding a niche where you operate that's a core niche that you can build upon later is usually a very helpful path, no matter what, no matter how generalist the company is. But making sure that you don't get kind of backed into a corner by paying attention to macro trends, market dynamics, the competitive landscape, buyer preferences is really important regardless of what niche you're operating in. So, for example, we use a totally different example. Like, it was possible last year to make an insanely good living as a realtor, maybe a super specialized realtor. You understand some market pretty well. And if you had access to inventory and customers, and, you could kind of decide how much money you want to make. And then, there's a class action lawsuit made it to the Supreme Court this year, earlier 2024. It basically said there was price fixing among realtors to charge, let's say, 5% commission, and that was illegal under antitrust law. Now, all of a sudden, if you were super niche and specialized, well, your life looks really different. If you were over-indexed on that, instead of, had a way to hedge that kind of lifestyle according to what threats might be possible, even if we didn't see them coming. So a general awareness is really helpful. A niche dedication is often helpful, but where you sit in the spectrum of super niche or super generalist probably varies.
It's interesting though, because it flies in the face of standard statistics where diversification reduces risk or standard deviation. So I on the face of it, there's that argument. But I think what most entrepreneurs realize is that by decreasing that standard deviation, you also essentially are reducing your ceiling. And if that's okay, great. But if there is the goal to not only reach that ceiling, but blow past it, then perhaps being more diverse is going to prevent you from doing that.
Yeah. So just because we're using first person examples here, in the case of Golden, we raised external financing. But in other companies, especially podcast listeners, many of them are bootstrapping their companies on their own, or maybe they're taking debt, from a lender. And in a situation like that, your enterprise value and the exit opportunities for your business are going to be dependent on your ability to build healthy economics, a healthy balance sheet, healthy cash flows. And so niche makes a lot of sense in a situation like that. In a situation where you're using a lot of external financing, defending the size of your market is also going to make a big difference for valuation multiples on either EBITDA or revenue.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, last question is just if there's anything you feel like I missed or anything you would like to tell the listeners, just want to give you that opportunity.
There certainly must be. Given how deep we went in this conversation, I would be delighted, to revisit it if there's ever any interest in that. But in the meantime, anyone who'd like to know more about Golden, please go to goldenvolunteer.com, and you can find free offerings for yourself as an individual or your organization, or you can find really sophisticated offerings, just depending. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send us an email at hello@goldenvolunteer.com. Thanks for having me.
Well, Sam, no, pleasure was mine. Really enjoyed the stories, especially as you were able to relate them to companies in different industries, companies of different size at different stages of their life cycle. I really appreciate your ability to translate your own experiences to those of people in many different situations. So for that, I thank you.
Thanks again, Nick.
Sam built a successful business doing what he loves while helping other people do the meaningful work they love too. There's something really powerful about challenging your whole team, incentivizing them to always strive for excellence. Generating that feedback loop, creating friendly competition, it all leads to doing the impossible. Golden is a successful business because the people who created it, the people who run it, and the people who use it all care deeply about the mission. This is something we should all strive for in our businesses. If you were inspired by this episode of Ambition, please share it with a friend or colleague. Thanks for listening.